Hello everyone, welcome back CBS Beyond the Gates next week. Kat thought she was used to the kind of clashes that defined Fairmont Crest, the place where every polished smile could hide a blade. But this latest confrontation with Eva felt different, not because it was louder, not because the insults were new, but because the core of it struck like a long-forming crack finally hit at the exact pressure point. Kat saw something in Eva's eyes that she used to dismiss as arrogance and reflexive hostility. Yet it looked more like fear of having a mask ripped away. Like Kat, Eva was exhausted from living under scrutiny, from being compared, from being labeled. And that fatigue turned every encounter between them into a war for control of the story of who they were. Kat didn't want to admit it, but sometimes her anger at Eva wasn't only because Eva was wrong. It was because Eva reflected choices Kat hated having to imagine. If life was a chessboard, who was ever allowed to follow the rules and who was forced to break them just to survive? So when the confrontation ignited, even if the surface still looked like the same old feud between two women who refused to back down, something new was forming underneath it. That current had a name: Izaiah Hawthorne. Kat didn't go to Winterfest to chase gossip or to collect new reasons to hate Eva. She went to the Winterfest photos because they felt like a thread. At first it was only a vague sense that Dr. Kyo didn't drift into their orbit by accident, that he was an arranged link appearing at the precise moments someone wanted sealed shut. Kat was practiced at following tiny details: an accidental angle, a handshake caught halfway, a slip of paper peeking from a pocket. She scanned every photo with the cold focus of someone who refused to be distracted by emotion. But the longer she stared, the more something pulled her out of her comfort zone. In some frames, Dr. Kyo stood in the background, far from the center of the event, as if he didn't belong to the party so much as to the deals made after doors closed. In other moments, his gaze wasn't on the camera at all, but fixed on someone just outside the frame, waiting for a signal. And when Kat began to stitch the pieces together, what emerged was no longer instinct. It was the shape of a trail, old but razor sharp, like broken glass that still carried blood. She didn't uncover the secret through a single stroke of luck, but through patience ruthless enough to forgive nothing. The traces of past dealings between Izaiah and Dr. Kyo surfaced like small nails hammered into a wall. Each one could be explained away, but together they formed a line you couldn't deny. And then Kat reached the most terrifying part: evidence that Izaiah had once hired Dr. Kyo to falsify medical records for one of them, either Kate or Eva, at some point in the past. This wasn't a harmless tweak to a number, not a cosmetic touch-up to a lab result. It was the manufacture of a medical narrative powerful enough to tilt an entire inheritance, or a crucial lawsuit. One diagnosis delivered at the right time, one sudden condition made official, one document stamped as legitimate, and morality was replaced by advantage. Kat's throat went dry because she understood what medical records meant in Fairmont Crest. They weren't only about health, they were about money, reputation, and the right to exist inside a family culture that devoured the weak. In that instant, Kat was no longer outside the story. She became the person holding an explosive secret, and in Fairmont Crest, holding a secret was like holding a grenade with the pin already pulled. Kat could choose silence to protect herself, but silence was its own kind of complicity, and she couldn't stomach it. She could storm straight to Eva and demand answers, but that would be like walking into an enemy's house wearing a sign that read, "I know." She felt the cruel paradox building in her chest. The more she wanted the truth, the more she had to hide the truth. The more she wanted to expose Izaiah, the more she knew Izaiah would never allow her the chance. And in the space between logic and fury, the most dangerous feeling of doubt in herself. She wondered if she was being pulled into a game whose rules were written long before she touched the board, and she was simply the next piece to be moved. That was why her confrontation with Eva couldn't be a full reveal. Kat stepped into it like someone walking on thin ice, weighing every word in her mind even without speaking it. She exposed only part of what she knew, just enough to test Eva's reaction, just enough to measure where Eva stood in the knot of this entire mess. Eva responded like someone cornered who refused to admit she was afraid. Her eyes sharpened, her jaw tightened, her defenses rose on instinct. Kat saw something in Eva that was both familiar and unsettling, grudge aimed not only at Kat, but at something deeper, like an old wound struck in exactly the wrong place. And exactly as Kat had predicted, no matter what their argument looked like on the surface, this confrontation instantly became a spark that created trouble between Eva and Izaiah. Because the moment Eva felt anyone digging into her medical pastor, Katesh could no longer treat Izaiah as unquestionable shelter. Trust, once chipped, begins to crumble in ways no one can control. The discovery didn't just tighten the tension between Kat and Eva. It stirred the embers of a conflict that had always been simmering between Eva, Kate, and Izaiah over money and power. Kat could feel the heat of it even when nobody said it out loud. Suspicion slipped into silences, turned ordinary gestures into ominous signals. If medical records had been falsified to manipulate an inheritance or a lawsuit, the questions would never stop at who did it. They would slide into who benefited, who was harmed, who was turned into a tool. And most brutally of all, Wo agreed to be one. Kat understood that if this leaked, it wouldn't only destroy a relationship. It could tear apart an entire family structure where honor was built from the things nobody dared to name. And then, as Fairmont Crest always proved, secrets never stayed still. Izaiah didn't need Kat to say more to sense she knew too much. Men like him lived by the instinct of power. They always recognized when the air changed. A pause that came too late, a glance that didn't hide fast enough, a question asked at the wrong time, and he would know there was a hole opening in the wall. Before Kat could decide her next move, she felt his shadow over the situation, not a public threat, but a pressure so invisible it made people censor themselves. He began planning to protect his secret, and that plan would never include Kat walking away with the full truth intact. The terrifying part was that Kat knew she was inside the spiral, and still she couldn't turn her back. Turning away would mean accepting that men like Izaiah could rewrite a woman's past with a document stamped legitimate. Kat tried to keep her mind sharp, told herself not to panic. But her body betrayed her in small ways. Her pulse spiked every time her phone buzzed. She felt like every pair of eyes in the neighborhood was guessing what she knew. And a strange fear settled in that the truth would be twisted until she became the villain for digging it up. She also couldn't ignore another possibility. If the falsified records were made for Kate or for Eva, then the other woman was inevitably tied in as a contrast point, a pressure lever. Their conflict had been fed for years on half-truths. And Izaiah might be the one who used medicine like a scalpel, cutting them open to take what he needed. Kat realized she wasn't only investigating Dr. Kyo anymore. She was touching the architecture of manipulation Izaiah had built, where love, hatred, and money were blended into a poison that smelled sweet. When night fell, Kat tried to arrange everything inside her head with logic. But logic in Fairmont Crest was always warped by emotion and power. She knew she had to move slowly to avoid steps that gave Izaiah a reason to strike first. But she also knew time wasn't on her side. Because once Izaiah started planning, he wouldn't wait for Kat to finish assembling the picture. She went back to the Winterfest photos again. And in a frame she'd previously dismissed as background, she noticed a detail that clenched her stomach. Something suggested the shady transaction wasn't buried in a distant past the way she'd tried to reassure herself. It might have resurfaced far more recently than she wanted to believe. Kat tightened her grip on her phone, understanding she had crossed the line between suspicion and real danger. And at that exact moment, a new signal flashed like a warning. Izaiah already knew she was digging through Winterfest, and he was moving his pieces. The most terrifying question now was which piece he would sacrifice first, Eva or Kat herself. Eva had always believed she understood Izaiah in the way only real love can understand someone, and not through promises spoken out loud, but through small habits, unconscious reflexes. The way he went quiet when he was anxious, and the way he tried to control everything when he felt power slipping from his hands. That was why this collision didn't arrive as a clean, undeniable caught in the act moment. It arrived through chance, the kind of chance Fairmont Crest likes to dismiss as harmless, even though it can be enough to collapse a trust that has already started to crack. Eva overheard a conversation between Donnie and Pamela. She didn't need every detail, only a few vague lines about setting a target on Izaiah, and suddenly the air around her changed. As if someone had cut the music and left only the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Around the same time, or shortly after, she saw Donnie behave in a way Eva couldn't honestly call innocent, a contained, deliberate flirtation, the kind of approach that carried intention. The kind of energy Donnie always wore, like a dare to anyone who happened to be holding what she wanted. Eva couldn't pretend she hadn't seen it. She couldn't soothe herself with the lie that it was just social play. Because the sharpest pain wasn't Donnie, it was the possibility that Izaiah had allowed the door to crack open, even slightly. With the tension between Eva and Kat already stacked high, Eva felt stretched so tight that one more pressure point could snap her clean in half. She had been forced to stay on guard with Kat, forced to prove herself under glances that were always ready to assign blame. And that constant defense left her without the softness required to tolerate any ambiguity from Izaiah. When a woman lives in a state of threat, whether it comes from reputation, comparison, or old wounds, what she needs most from the man beside her is certainty. And Eva began to realize that certainty was slipping. She didn't want to become the kind of person who suspects, the kind who checks, the kind who interrogates like a judge. But because she didn't want that version of herself, the moment suspicion arrived, It felt like humiliation, like her heart was being forced to do work it despised. Izaiah, on the other side of the equation, wasn't clueless or carefree. His guilt didn't appear overnight, it accumulated like wet sand in a shoe. The farther you walk, the more it hurts. He could feel the relationship fracturing, not because of one specific argument, but because the empty spaces between them were growing wider. The moments Eva stayed silent longer than usual. The moment her eyes looked at him as if she were weighing something she couldn't name. The moment she stopped sharing the small details of her day. Izaiah knew he had helped create those spaces, no matter how many good intentions he tried to hide behind. And then Donnie's offer, which could have been framed as a simple professional opportunistic laboratory on a modeling project, turned into a hook that snagged his weakest point: the need to be seen, to be validated, to feel desirable and valuable in a world that measures people by what they can deliver. The hardest truth, and the one Izaiah hated most about himself, was that the confusion didn't come from Donnie forcing anything. It came from him allowing it to take root. Donnie didn't only offer a project, she offered a state of being. A fantasy where Izaiah was still the kind of man worth pursuing. The closeness, the moments that drifted over the line of right and wrong with subtlety, stirred something in him he didn't want to admit existed. And the more he hid, the more cowardly he felt. He started to believe that if he stayed silent, sooner or later Eva would stop forgiving the silence. Even if he had never done anything physical, because Eva didn't only need him faithful in action. She needed him faithful in mind, in priority. In the sense that he would not let anyone else step into the private space that belonged to them. So when Izaiah finally went to Eva, the timing was brutal. The tension between Eva and Kat still hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear, keeping Eva in a posture of constant readiness as if she might be attacked at any moment. Izaiah walked into that meeting not to fix it quickly, but because he couldn't stand watching their relationship drift into fog. He began to confess in an atmosphere heavy enough to press on the chest, and even without dialogue, you could feel the remorse in the way he approached it. In the slowness of his admission that Donnie had approached him with an offer, and that he had not been as firm as he should have been. He let out the piece of truth that shamed him most, not Donnie's interest, but his own reaction to it. When he told her that the offer and the proximity it created had left him with mixed feelings. Blurred feelings he couldn't control the way he wanted to. It was as if he had lifted his hand and shattered his own protection. It was the moment a man stared straight at his weakness and accepted that it might destroy what he treasured most. Eva froze. Not the kind of freeze that explodes instantly into rage, but the kind that turns your blood cold for a few seconds. As if the brain needs time to translate pain into reality. She felt betrayed even though Izaiah confessed to emotion rather than a concrete act. Because for Eva, emotion is never only, emotion is the root of action. If he had allowed that feeling to exist, it meant he had opened a door she believed only she was allowed to enter. That realization dragged up a chain of uncomfortable memories, their recent conflicts. The times he dodged her eyes, the moments he grew defensive when she asked harmless questions. Suddenly everything replayed under a harsher light, and in that light, Eva began to wonder what had been real and what had been performance designed to keep the peace. Eva questioned Izaiah not because she needed an apology, but because she needed to measure the depth of the fracture. She wanted to know how serious it was. Whether Donnie in his mind was a passing breeze or a storm forming on the horizon. She hated that she had to ask, hated that she was becoming the woman who demanded a choice. But the fact that Donnie had been framed as a target had stripped Eva of safety. And when she forced Izaiah to stand between her and Donnie, the crisis stopped being simple jealousy. It became a battle of value. Was Eva still his priority? Or had she become nothing more than a familiar habit he kept because it was convenient? Izaiah begged for understanding in a way that made him both pitiful and infuriating. He insisted he loved Eva, tried to prove that everything with Donnie was only a test. A temptation he recognized too late. Yet he also admitted his own softness. His vulnerability to the thrill of being chosen, of being wanted. That admission hurt Eva in a different way. It didn't just say Donnie was appealing. It suggested Izaiah had been missing something deep enough in his life with Eva. That he could be shaken by another woman's interest. Eva didn't know whether that was true, but pain doesn't require proof to exist. It only needs an anchor, and this was an anchor sharp enough to tear flesh. Eva stood before a brutal reality: forgive him to save what they had, or leave to preserve the last of her self-respect. She imagined the cost of staying a future where Donnie's presence would ignite suspicion. Every time she appeared, every time Izaiah's phone lit up, every time he came home later than usual. She also imagined the cost of living an enormous hollow, a sense of failure, and the terrifying idea that if she walked away, Donnie would win without having to do anything more. Eva recognized the most frightening part: sometimes you don't know if you're choosing out of love, or out of pride. She wanted to believe she was strong enough to walk away. But she also wanted to believe what they had couldn't be destroyed by an offer and a moment of weakness. Those two desires pulled her in opposite directions until she felt split down the middle. The ending didn't come with an explosion. It came with silence, heavy and slow, like a door closing with cruel patience. The space between them thickened until it felt almost physical, each of them trapped inside their own thoughts. And the future of their relationship became undefined in the most frightening way, not because a decision had been made, but because neither of them could be sure what the right decision even was anymore. And if I'm allowed to weave in something personal as the writer, this is the kind of ending that haunts men not because it's dramatic on the surface, but because it feels uncomfortably real. Sometimes love doesn't die from blatant betrayal, but from small fractures ignored for too long. From temptations that look harmless until they quietly bend trust out of shape. I find myself wanting Eva to be strong enough to leave and protect herself, while also wanting her to be spared the cruelty of starting over from ruins. And that tug of war is exactly why I can't believe the story ends here, because the moment Eva turns her back to walk away, or the moment she decides to stay, Donnie won't remain still. And the choice Izaiah thinks he has confessed in time may only be the first step toward a much bigger tragedy waiting for them just ahead. On our TV Spoilers channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about Beyond the Gates.